Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth. Ooh, the voice is going as well. The fourth session. So, when we decided we were going to do work on how do we get more Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, heritage people into deputy headship, and open up that pipeline, one of the obvious questions came up. Well, what are you going to do about the people on the other side, the people who are in charge of the recruitment? And we thought to ourselves, we need someone who's brave, who's not afraid to tell the truth, someone who is going to be able to bring across powerfully why we need to change the way we do recruitment and how we can go about making it more inclusive. Today isn't going to be the silver bullet that's going to magic everything into change, but it is going to be an important step in bringing us along. How do we think differently about recruitment? And how do you, as the people in the seats of power who are handling this recruitment, how can you change your practice so that it can become far more inclusive and you can get more leaders coming through that pipeline? So we set out to find the best people to do it, and I did, because I already knew them. Johan, Jensen, and Louise, Ishani, two of the stars of our world. And they are here today to share part of their expertise, to start you on that journey, to start your thinking, and to bring you about. So sit back, pay lots of attention, write lots of notes, take note of everything that's going on, ask tons of questions. And to make sure you're keeping up with everything, at the bottom, we've got closed captions. Put that on so you can listen to it and read it as it goes along. But tons and tons of questions, and please make sure that you are fully involved because this is your time for action. So now I'm going to hand over to Johan. Johan, take it away.
Alana, thank you so much. I've never been described as a star from anyone, so I really appreciate that introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's joining our session this evening. We have a broad list of attendees. So the majority are currently governors, but we also have senior leaders in schools and others from the sector who've got different expertise. But you are all so welcome. And both Louise and I, we hope that you will take away some practical ideas for making recruitment inclusive. As Alana said, closed captions are available, and we will also be recording the session, and we'll be putting that on the BayMed website after this session. The chat function is available, so please do pose your questions to us, and we will have time at the end of the session to deal with at least some of those. So tonight we will be posing a series of questions, and that will give you some ideas of how you can make your school become more inclusive recruiters. We'll be asking what we mean by being inclusive, so kind of starting from the beginning, and also why we should recruit inclusively, and what the role is of governors, and how and what questions that you should be asking. And what are some of the barriers in inclusive recruitment, and how can we remove these barriers? So before we launch in, I just want to say a bit about All In Education. So I founded All In Education in 2017, and we've worked with a range of schools and groups of schools since then. Previous to founding All In Education, I worked on EDI issues in the business and charity sectors. In our EDI work, we take learning and best practice from across sectors to inform our work in education. I started my career in LGBT inclusive education and have, after that, worked to develop and deliver leadership programs to middle and senior leadership in schools. I'm just going to hand over to Louise to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. To Louise, please.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. So very briefly, my background is as a teacher. I was a primary teacher in central London, became a deputy and acting head, And then 20 years ago, and now I moved into school improvement, first at local authority level and then with the Department of Education. And I've since then worked with charities, including Ambition Institute, leading on programs to do with leadership development, and at the same time doing work around inclusion and more inclusive leadership in schools. Great to meet you all today.
Thanks, Louise. So to kick off today, I wanted firstly to start from the very beginning, to ask and answer the question of what is diversity and inclusion. And I want to define what we mean by that. Everyone has got different definitions of what diversity and inclusion means. But at All in Education, the way that we define diversity is pretty simple. So diversity is our biological makeup, our lived experience, our context that we're finding ourselves in. And that diversity then is a descriptor. It's a descriptor of what is. And the definition ends there. Inclusion is a completely different kettle of fish. Inclusion, if you are missing any of the components that you can see on this screen, either skill or ability or will, you are less likely to be able to leverage the benefits of diversity. Inclusion is something that you can learn, something that you can practice, and something that you can develop, both as an individual and also as an organization. It's nothing that is fixed, it's movable. And we see it as the mechanism that you can use to leverage the benefits of diversity. So with this in mind, I think it's useful to take a look at how All in Education, how we view work around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So traditionally, governors and senior leaders have taken a compliance-based approach to equality, diversity, and inclusion. So avoiding breaking laws and regulations. This is, of course, extremely important. But we argue that the role of governors and leaders go far beyond compliance. Since May last year and the murder of George Floyd, the education sector has started to take a hard look in the mirror and seen how very little ethnic diversity there is in education and in our individual schools. And this is particularly among the staff population. At All in Education, this is certainly part of the problem that we're facing. However, unless we look at how inclusive our workplaces are of all staff, we're unlikely to make huge change in the makeup and the diversity of our workplace. So we think the journey starts with you as an individual. So we encourage you to look at yourselves and also ask yourself why this matters to you and to you as organizations. So I would also encourage you to ask how you identify through a diversity lens. I'm a white gay male. I'm from Sweden. I'm also a father of a young adoptive daughter. That really informs my diversity. I would also encourage you to ask yourself the question of when you have felt excluded. And in those instances, how did that affect you both emotionally, but also your performance in that moment in time? This can help build empathy and true understanding of your privileges and your barriers. When we then start to look, we can then start to look at removing barriers in our systems, in our school systems, and our behaviors. After starting from yourself, you can start to move to look at systems and behaviors. And this is all of our responsibilities. This is senior leaders' responsibilities, it's the governor's responsibilities, and then, of course, wider amongst the staff population. At All in Education, we also want the sector to remove the responsibility of breaking down these barriers from removing the responsibility of this from minority groups or marginalized majority groups like women. That it's not their responsibility to break down these barriers. It is all of our responsibilities. So by doing this and by breaking down these barriers to inclusion, we want to move organization to a place where you as individuals and collectively as institutions make better decisions. That's what it's all about, making better decisions. And of course, today we're talking about recruitment. So it's about making better recruitment decisions. So why should we have an inclusive approach to recruitment? Inclusive recruitment, it's about fairness. It's about giving people a fair chance and access. It's about ensuring that you really explore the talent out there. And in most cases, I would argue, this is not what's currently happening in education. Most schools don't conduct merit-based recruitment, and you will see why we think this later on in this session. Inclusive recruitment processes and practices, they strive to ensure that these processes are merit-based. Inclusive recruitment also enables access to a larger group of applications. All schools want a larger group of applications. All schools want a larger group of quality applications. So what inclusive recruitment does is also to focus on getting the very best talent wherever it's coming from and not putting up unnecessary barriers to some talent. Inclusive recruitment also increases competition for talent within the sector and outside. It is important that the education sector is competitive in the work market, competing with other sectors to get the very best talent to teach our children. It also aims to make jobs in education more attractive. When you post a job as a school, that's your point of opportunity to sell a job. What is attractive about it? What will make that candidate feel like they will belong in that school, regardless of their background? They will be listened to, they will be understood. And lastly, simply, it saves money and time. If you can get better decisions in your recruitment process, you are less likely to have to re-advertise for positions. And also, overall, you will just make better hiring decisions. So what's the role of governors in all of this? We all, of course, play a part in this. Governors play a crucial part in this. And we have identified 4 areas. These are not exclusive. There are, of course, other things that are your role in terms of your diversity and inclusion remit. But we've picked out 4 that we think are absolutely critical. The first one is to ensure that inclusion is embedded into your school values and that your school values are applied to the whole school community. And by this, we mean it's not just applicable to students, it is applicable to staff, it's applicable to parents and the community as a whole. We also see a role for governors to dispel and challenge the assumption that parents, fee-paying or not fee-paying, want a particular or a traditionally looking and sounding head teacher. You as a governor, you are the protector of the values of the school. If your values can ensure inclusive recruitment, it is also your role to challenge these assumptions that a head teacher looks in a certain way, walks in a certain way, and talks in a certain way. And the third one, this concept of eyes on and hands off is now a mantra in governance. And yes, but when the now retired General Stanley McChrystal coined this concept, he also crucially caveated the need to ensure that the leader has all the information necessary to make good decisions. So does your senior team or your governor board, do you have all of the tools necessary to be able to have an eyes-on, hands-off approach to inclusion? And the last point, we encourage you to work with other governors who oversee school culture, learning and development, and recruitment, and to embed inclusion into these aspects of governing work. School culture, talent management, and learning and development and recruitment are all interlinked. If you can embed inclusion in all of those, I think you will reap the benefits of that. So asking questions is a big part of any governor's role. And there's some key questions that we can ask of ourselves and also of each other when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And we wanted to point out some questions that we think would be useful for you to ask. The first one is of yourself, and that's about your own learning. What do I need to learn to know that my school is doing a good job to achieve greater diversity and more inclusive workplaces? And you also need to ask the right questions of your senior executive team. And also, those of you who are heads and senior leaders, these are questions to ask of yourself and also to ask of your colleagues. And this is to provide support and challenge. The first one is to know your people. And this is about numbers and it's about diversity data. What does your staff population look like? What does the candidate slate look like for a particular role? The second one is to challenge the selection criteria and take calculated risks to ensure fresh thinking always joins your team when you're recruiting for new staff. What criteria don't we critically need or are unnecessarily exclusive? And what have we said and done to challenge recruiters like RS Academics, to ensure diverse slates? And have we communicated to potential candidates and wider what we are currently doing or have done to make this school recruitment processes, talent management processes more inclusive? So I hope this gives you some pointers to the role that you can play and also the type of questions to ask. There is one point that I want to tease out a little bit further, and that is the first one about knowing your people. Our population is changing, and our population has been changing rapidly over the past few decades. And what we see in education staff, and this is data from the Department of Education, is that with white British staff is overrepresented compared to the labour force as a whole. And that conversely, almost every other ethnic group is underrepresented compared to the overall labour force. What is it about education per se, not other sectors, that is not as attractive to minority ethnic groups compared to white British people? So the question to ask is, why is this the case in my school? If this is currently the case in your school, but in the vast majority of cases, I'm assuming it is. The second step is to ask another question. What does the demographic data look like in your school, in your community, and beyond? If you don't know the answer to this question, I challenge you and encourage you to find out. What's the diversity looking like in your community? Where are the opportunities and where are the challenges? And on that note, I am going to hand over to Louise to take us through the next section.
So in this next section, we're going to look at barriers to inclusive recruitment. And just to say, I was very fortunate that I was asked to hold some focus groups with aspiring BAME deputies and head teachers to help us develop this conference. And as part of that, we asked them to share some of their experiences around recruitment process and also retention in roles. And as part of this look at barriers, there's a theory input at the beginning, but I want you to really hone in as well into some of the examples I'm going to share that came from the focus group participants. So we're going to talk to you about 4 key barriers that particularly have an impact in the recruitment process. First one, we refer to the inclusion illusion. So if I was to ask you, rhetorically perhaps, to put your hand up if you like diversity, I'm sure most of you would be waving at me. And especially in education, if you're a teacher or a governor, you've made that commitment to a school, we normally expect that, yes, we like diversity, we see the benefit of it. But does this play out in reality? And what I mean by that is, if you look at your actions as individuals, how much do your actions line up with your belief around diversity? For example, if I asked you to name your 3 best friends, the 3 people you spend most time with at work, your partner, and to draw a circle around them on a piece of paper, that would be your in-group. And if you looked at that group, how diverse is it? For most of us, when we do that exercise, what we often see is a reflection of ourselves, maybe in terms of education, ethnicity, gender. This natural tendency to gravitate and surround ourselves that people who are like ourselves, is something that happens. We feel comfortable talking and making decisions with and being in a team with people like ourselves. But if you translate that into recruitment process, what you then get is lack of diversity and a lack of inclusion. This tendency to gravitate to people that are like ourselves is something we call homophily. And it is a barrier, a particular barrier in recruitment. It creates homogenous inner circles, and it means that in recruitment decisions, people who may be shortlisting, for example, or in an interview panel, may have a tendency to look for something in a candidate that they identify with and maybe ignore all the information about what that candidate could bring and add to the team. What you need to do in order to counter this particular barrier is to look at your inner circle honestly and think about how can you increase your contact and knowledge with people who are not represented in your in-group. It might be in the work setting or as a governor, if thinking about your relationships and thinking about the media that you consume, the people you follow on social media, the books you're reading. How can you increase your knowledge and understanding of the groups that you don't normally come into contact in your lives, so that when you are making decisions, you are able to have a broader lens, a diversity lens, an inclusion lens, which means that your biases, which we'll come on to talk to, are not blocking you from seeing the potential that is in front of you. So that's the first barrier, homophily. Let's move on to think about the next barrier. So we're going to talk about bias. Now, bias in of itself is not a bad thing. It is a necessary neurological function that helps us to navigate the world. It helps us to make sense of the world that we are in. But even though it's helping us, the next few steps show us that sometimes, even though these shortcuts that our brain takes can have unintended consequences. And when these shortcuts lead to us making incorrect decisions, they can have a negative impact if unchecked. Not just on us, but on those around us. So what are the examples of the type of bias that we might find playing a function in the recruitment process? Confirmation bias. We're making assumptions based on prior experience. Oh, I had an interaction with someone like that before, so I'm guessing this person will be just the same or similar. And that for that person could be a positive bias, or it could be a negative, which means perhaps they don't get shortlisted or invited to it, or invited to come and look around the school, because you've decided that a person like that just won't fit in from your previous experience. Then there's anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is when, during decision making, an individual focuses in on an initial piece of information to make subsequent judgments. So that could be you as a governor during a recruitment process being presented with a CV. And on the CV, you hone in on the fact that the particular candidate has attended an Oxbridge University. Oh, well, of course they're going into the yes pile, because I believe that people who went to Oxbridge are automatically always going to be the best candidate. So let's put them in the yes pile. You've got an anchoring bias. Another example of bias is affinity bias. And that really feeds into what we were talking before about this tendency to want to be around people who are like ourselves. You know, you generate towards people like ourselves. You see someone as when they come for interview and standing in the foyer, and you think, yeah, they look like my kind of person. So already you've got this positive image of how well they're going to do and how well they'll fit into your school team. The one type of bias that lots of people are focused particularly on at the moment is unconscious bias. So when we talk about unconscious bias, what we're talking about is associations that your brain makes without your awareness, without your intention, and without your control. And as many of you know, there are tests like the Harvard IAT test that you can do that can give you an insight. And why that's important is that lots of research will tell you that biases impact our behavior, and unconscious biases have a massive impact on the decisions that we make. So if you can become more aware of your biases in the recruitment process, hopefully you'll make more focused decisions. So let's move on to the next barrier. This barrier is stereotypes. So we all understand stereotypes to be a preconceived, oversimplified generalizations about an entire group of people without regard for individual differences. And we know that there are positive stereotypes and negative stereotypes, but the fact is both of these can have negative consequences. So, for example, the stereotype that all women are caring. In the recruitment process in a secondary school, that might translate to thinking, well, the female candidates will be good for the pastoral roles. Why is it such a barrier? Stereotypes, if they're left unchallenged, will lead to prejudice. People sometimes excuse stereotypes as banter, as a joke, but actually left unchallenged, they become a part of the accepted reality within a school. So it's important within the recruitment process that you are checking that stereotypes aren't feeding into your ideas about particular candidates, and that you, as people in positions of authority and power, are not discriminating by denying access and opportunities to candidates based on their characteristics. The final barrier that we are going to look at is the barrier of microaggressions. Now, if you don't know about microaggressions and you work in a school, I'm sure you find, especially a secondary school, you'll find that a lot of your students do. So what are they? Microaggressions may present as an innocuous comment or behaviour, but have the impact of highlighting a person's difference from the majority represented group. Microaggressions can occur anywhere, from non-Black people tucking their phones away or clutching their bags when Black people pass by on the street, to a heterosexual person at a party assuming that two LGBTQ plus people would get along purely due to their mutual queerness. Some of the examples on the slide are examples from our personal experience. The one with the girl holding the placard. I don't see you as really Black, which is actually meant as a compliment. The one I get, can I touch your hair? You know, where are you really from? Your name is so hard to pronounce. So maybe I'll avoid talking to you because that would be embarrassing, or I'll make a joke about it. People having comments made to them about their accents. Amazing, you hardly have an accent at all. Or comments about their sexual orientation. Oh, you're gay. You should meet my friend David. He's gay too, and you'll love him. Oh, you're transgender. You don't look like it at all. Why do people talk about microaggressions so much? You might be asking yourself, and what's it got to do with recruitment? You'll see from some of the quotes that we have from the focus group that these innocuous comments that happen so frequently can feel like death by 1,000 cuts. If they are relentless and frequent, they create a hostile environment that can actually lead to decreases in people's ability to be able to perform. So if we're thinking about the recruitment process, and as part of that you have experienced a microaggression, how able are you to perform effectively, for example, in an interview? How fair then is that playing field in terms of making sure every candidate has an equal opportunity to show their best side within the recruitment process? So now I'm going to show you some of the examples that we got from the focus group. So there are two things. One is, what are the challenges that they face? And the other were some direct messages that they had for governors, trustees, boards, in terms of what they could be doing to make the recruitment process more inclusive. So I won't read all of the comments, but just to pick out some of those that perhaps weren't represented in the 4 barriers that we've looked at, it was really striking that so many of the focus group participants spoke of the fact that they had been denied access to relevant career professional development that would allow them to present on their CV and their applications evidence of having relevant training and the knowledge that they might need to acquire the next level in their career. So what that's actually saying is that you might look at someone's application, and if you're asking for people to note down any recent professional development, don't be surprised that some of your BAME candidates can't match up. It's not because they don't want to access the CPD. It's often their experience that when they ask, for example, to go on to be involved in the National Professional Qualification for Head Teachers, there's somebody who's a gatekeeper who's denying them access to that opportunity whilst giving their colleagues that access. And what was quite sad, really, was the number of focus group participants who have resorted to paying for their own professional development in order to be able to access the same level of opportunities as their white peers. The other common thread was that many of them spoke of having been given leadership responsibilities without title. So they're asked to be, for example, a member of extended leadership for a year. They're giving significant extra additional activities to do, but they're never formally given that title that they can put down on their application form to say that they've had that experience at that recognized level. And often also concerning is that they might be taking on this extra responsibility without the remuneration. So why does that matter for you then in terms of being people looking at applications? You need to be prepared that some of your BAME candidates are not going to have the traditional looking career pathway and professional development profile that you would expect. And that you should understand why that is happening. It's not a reflection on their ability or their willingness to engage in learning, they may have been systematically denied the opportunity to get those roles and also that experience. The last one is very poignant. Many of the candidates in the focus group talked about being pigeonholed earlier on in their career into certain middle leadership roles, which then made it very hard for them to progress to senior leadership roles. So in primary, that looked like being given leadership for around subjects such as PE, PSHE and DT, rather than being offered the opportunity to focus in on literacy or numeracy or science. Or in secondary schools, we hear a lot of stories about BAME staff being asked to do pastoral roles, heads of year, because there's a perception that they can deal with the difficult pupils, when really their heart is set on a more curriculum-focused role. So reason why we're sharing these quotes is to give you a sense of the challenges, the real-life challenges experienced by people who may want to apply for roles in your school. This next slide has some quotes that relate to people looking to apply for roles in new schools, but also relates also to experiences people have internally in their own schools when they're trying to progress their career. So obviously, we're going to talk about in a bit more detail the obvious things like shortlisting and interview practices. Participants tell us that they can't prove it, but they believe that on occasions, just the fact that they have a non-British sounding name, accent, or religious dress has meant that they haven't progressed through the recruitment process. And one example that I found quite interesting was people saying that if they visited schools, which is the thing that we encourage candidates to do for senior positions, they often didn't get shortlisted. Whereas if they didn't visit, they were more likely to be shortlisted. So they felt that there was something about their engagement with the staff during school visits that created a barrier to them progressing in the recruitment process. The second bullet point there talks about a lot of the candidates talked about getting down to the last two when applying for a role, and that being a repeated experience. And you might say, well, that's encouraging, they've got down to the last two. But what was really interesting was the challenges they faced when trying to find out why they weren't chosen for the actual role. What was it the other candidate had that meant that they had the edge, and what could they do differently in order to be successful next time? And people's experiences range from trying to get feedback and just being completely ignored to asking for feedback, but just having an explanation that was so vague, it didn't sound credible. And the impact of that for these candidates, it really knocks their confidence. And it also knocks their confidence in the fact, is this process actually fair or is it biased? Some of the things we've mentioned already, microaggressions, other things, people believing that because perhaps they've got a qualification, a first language that's not British, that somehow is a reason for them not being shortlisted. And something that Johan already alluded to is that a view that people are not willing to take the risk to have a Black senior leader in school because they have a perception that parents, other stakeholders will not see them as credible, and only making that exception if they can justify it in terms of having a substantial ethnic minority population. One of the final things on this slide, which I think is quite important, is to do with internal progression. The participants in the focus group gave some quite moving examples of where they've gone for internal opportunities to progress their career. So these may be secondment opportunities, temporary leadership roles, where the internal processes have been biased. And one example was a participant who had followed the rules and presented a proposal for a project that they would carry out in their extended leadership role, and didn't get shortlisted and didn't get the opportunity. But she knew the candidate who did. Their colleague, who was white and male, got the role, but he disclosed to her that he hadn't actually submitted any project proposal. And what that kind of captured from the group was this feeling that in order for a BAME teacher to progress their career, they have to work twice as hard, just sometimes to stand still, and that there isn't a fair playing field internally when it comes to career progression. So these are some of the suggestions that they had for recruiters in order for them to consider how they could make the experience more inclusive for BAME candidates. A need to debias the recruitment process, which Johan has already spoke to, greater diversity on panels, but also panel members getting trained on the impact of conscious and unconscious bias. The other one I'm going to pick out is this idea about the myth that there needs to be challenged, that having a non-white leader in a majority white school is a risk. And they felt that recruiters needed to develop their understanding of microaggressions and their impact when experienced as part of the recruitment process. So there's quite a lot to take in. I'm going to hand over now to Johan, who's going to talk about the things that you can be doing to kind of break this chain in terms of the experiences that BAME candidates have experienced.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm hoping to brighten the mood so that people can actually see like a way through this, what you can actually do. Before giving you some ideas on how you can kind of technically remove barriers, I want to give you some general pointers that I think are highly relevant for inclusive recruitment practices. The first one, and I can't overstate how important this is. Inclusion starts with I. And this goes for every governor, it goes for every member of SLT. It starts with you. It doesn't start with changing things out there or changing systems. This starts with you. And we would propose a three-step model. So the first one is committing and instructing yourself to be fair. That you will treat people who are different fairly and objectively, and not to stereotype or make assumptions. The second one is then to take it a step further and to give yourself time to listen to people's stories, like we just heard from the focus group. Listen and hear what those barriers are. I would also say in this model, when you model, then to definitely know your people. Go back to that data point that I pointed out before. Know your people. Look to disconfirm a stereotype when you hear it, when you see it, and be accountable and challenge others constructively and review your decisions. Even when the decisions have gone well, how can you know the reasons why a decision went well if you haven't reviewed that decision? Do that in the recruitment process. When you go through and you do audits, for example, review your decisions, review positive decisions and review other decisions. And then the third one is about embedding this practice so that you role model inclusion. Louise was talking about the inclusion illusion. And as governors, asking yourself, who are you talking to when you go to your school? And who are you not talking to? Who are you listening to? Who are you not listening to? But also when you look at your inner circle and you're recruiting for a new head teacher or a new senior leader, whose networks are you tapping into? if your governing body is all white, their networks are very likely to be all white, which will just decrease the chances of you getting a diverse slate. So how can you diversify your professional inner circle, both in school and out of school, in order to get a more diverse network? And to keep learning and emphasize the importance of fairness, objectivity, and diversity. Have that at the front of your mind when you're taking decisions. Fairness, objectivity, and diversity. One big part of the barriers to inclusion that Louise has talked about is around bias and the lack of diversity in processes where you're making decisions. And to mitigate against bias and groupthink when taking key decisions like recruitment, to mitigate against this is to ask who is in the room. What different perspectives, lived experiences are informing our decisions, and who is missing from the room. And you can apply this, in this instance, to recruitment. You can apply that to very key decision-making points in the life cycle of a school. Where do we need to be asking the question of who is in the room making this decision? I understand that you can't do this for every decision that you're taking. But when you make crucial decisions like recruitment, I'd encourage you to ask this. And then another way of thinking about this, I always refer to Daniel Kahneman, because I think he's got a lot to say about cognitive bias. Daniel Kahneman, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years back, and he's done a lot of work around cognitive bias. And he came up with the concepts of system 1 and system 2 thinking, which was then popularized in his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And what I would encourage you to do is to acknowledge, first of all, that most of our decision-making takes place in system 1. It's for our everyday decisions. It's for fast decisions. It's those decisions that are mired in our biases, the biases that are essential to our decision-making, but can have unintended consequences. So usually for automatic decisions where you've done it on a very, very regular basis, routine tasking decisions, but these are very error prone because you're very much basing it on previous experiences. But most of our decisions, they lie here. What I challenge you to do and what I encourage you to do is to identify key decision-making points where you and your governing board and the senior team moves into system 2 thinking, and where you do this very purposefully, and where you slow down the thinking, where you are conscious of your biases, your stereotypes and your unconscious biases, and where you also create a safe space where you challenge each other on these. And this is for effortful decisions. Recruitment is certainly one of them. But a recruitment decision is also a very expensive decision to make, or can be a very expensive decision to make. It can be complex because there's so many variables that you're taking into account when you're making this decision. But if you're moving into system 2 thinking at this point, the result is more likely to be reliable. And then there is a whole host of things that you can do technically to remove barriers in recruitment processes. And I'm going to show you some examples here. And again, this is not exclusive. And for some of them might jar a bit. For others, you can't really see it working in your context. But hopefully you're open-minded to that these are examples that have been implemented. Many of them have been very impactful. So see what you can take away from this and what you think can be implemented tomorrow, or maybe 6 months down the line, when your whole team have done some work on inclusion starts with I. The first one is to erase information on CVs that can influence your bias. So it can be, as one of the focus group members already said, it can be the name, can be the gender, also age, and the education institutions that they have attended. Everything from primary school up. We're also seeing benefits of reviewing your selection criteria and job descriptions, and focus on critical success factors for the role. So you can remove the type of grade of university degree that you require, various attributes that are exclusionary in a candidate, and also reduce the number of desirable attributes. Instead, focus on the essential attributes. The desirable attributes that can be taken into account later on in the recruitment process when you see the person more fully. And then hire teams, not just individuals. What we mean here is that we encourage you to think about the strengths and the weaknesses of the entire team when you hire a new position. Think about the different mindsets, backgrounds, and experiences, and not just the technical skills needed for the role, in order to encourage more innovation and also to avoid groupthink. So think team, not just individuals. And also, very crucially, and this underpins our whole philosophy of inclusive recruitment, and that is moving away from thinking about a hire as a cultural fit, and instead focusing on cultural add. What is the person adding to the culture of this school that we don't currently have? Use diverse interview panels. And you remember the definition of diversity. Diversity is not just about race, it's not just about sexual orientation or gender. It is about different experiences. So diverse interview panels is easy in some, more easy in some schools than others when it comes to ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth, but not in all schools. But what hinders you from inviting someone from a different department in to be on the recruitment panel? There will be different selection criteria that person can evaluate the candidate on. So diversify the interview panels, and also give explicit license to panel members to challenge decisions from a diversity and inclusion perspective. We have seen in some cases that you have a panel member whose sole job is to challenge and look out for biases in the recruitment process. Everything from how questions are being asked. Are they being asked in the same way of each candidate? Or is one candidate prompted more times than another candidate? Target underrepresented groups in your recruitment processes and in your advertisements. By all means, use TES or Guardian Jobs, but what other sources can you use? What internal sources and internal networks can you be using? Are you making full use of governors' networks? Are you using the resources that are available out there in terms of social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, and various interest groups on Twitter to push out various roles? And also set requirements for recruiters. Challenge them on diverse slates. If you're getting homogeneous slate, ask questions of why are we only getting homogeneous slates? You can also implement schemes for guaranteed interviews. Traditionally, this has been used around disability, But equality legislation now allows this across underrepresented groups. So guaranteed interviews are for underrepresented groups, for candidates who meet a minimum criteria, but because they're from an underrepresented groups in your context, they're invited to interview. Never guaranteed a job, but it's giving that chance to see someone who's different from the rest of your staff population. This is also called the Rooney Rule. So lastly, before going to questions, I just want to put up here the type of work that we do at All in Education. We work very extensively with senior leadership, and we work with them in a deep and collaborative way, both from a training perspective, but also to set senior teams up to develop their equality and diversity and inclusion strategy as part of our leadership program. We also work to develop more diverse and inclusive curriculum. We focus both on what a diverse curriculum could and should contain, but also, very crucially, how a diverse curriculum is delivered and taught. Because as we said before, inclusion starts with I. So all teachers, they need to do the work around inclusion starts with I before moving on to thinking and teaching about diversity out there. Who are they bringing into this classroom? Who of themselves are they bringing into this classroom? Who are they bringing into this classroom when they are teaching a diverse curriculum? How aware are they about the sensitivities and also the emotions that some particular topics evoke in students, and so on and so forth? And then lastly, what we also do is to conduct audits around HR, recruitment, and also talent management. And we work extensively also with RS Academics on surveying both pupils, alumni, and also staff.
Now we roll it all up. So across the week, we started off by thinking, why is it that we need to make change happen? We did some work with our deputy heads, and we've worked directly with our head teachers so that we've demystified. And today you've got some really solid ideas, but I'd like to emphasize something. Ideas are nothing unless they're a part of a wider strategy. So it's not for you to run and act. It is for you to think, what do I need to do next? Do I need more information? Reach out to Johan, reach out to RS Academics, reach out to BMed. Do I need more from them? Do I need to have more ideas and information first? And then how do I put together a solid strategy that's going to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion across my school? Because we want to do differently. Now, all of you here have already took that first step because you are here to understand and therefore make that point of action. So well done, you've took the first step and you're making that action. But this is not a passive process. There's a lot more that needs to come into it, and there's a lot more that needs to be built into it. And we are here to guide, help, and support you, as are so many others within the network.